Welcome back to Side Quests IX episode 5. Back with me, my perennial party member and constant companion, Wes Schantz. Wes, good to see you on this fine Sunday. How are you?
Yes, good. It's good to be back on our normal time, our normal place, our normal pets. Got my cat here. You got your dog. So
Yes.
we're a party of four. We're ready to go.
Yes. No, yeah. Especially in this game where 3 and 4 are played with in such interesting ways. One thing I'll note to the audience is that I just finished the longest article of my short career so far as a scholar earlier today. And I've been spending all weekend on it as well as a bunch of time before this weekend. And so for me, that's sort of intellectually like having just concluded a 100K race. In fact, I think that'd probably be easier on me, definitely mentally, than
Uh,
finishing the article and giving it the necessary revisions that I need to. That said, I'm very excited to be released from that stress and to be doing this instead.
I congratulate you. It sounds like a cool article. It's Dante and Final Fantasy, and uh, I guess a lot of secondary material probably has come into it as well, which is always interesting to see how those things interact. The one very recent probably has a pretty small secondary literature, although I don't know, maybe. Whereas Dante has got like, 1,000 years or so of people taking their uh, yeah, their full mental energy and their full intellect to bear on his work. So um, yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Do you know when exactly it's coming out, or is it just sometime sort
It's
of soon?
it's going to be sometime sort of soon.
Okay,
My reviewers have to have the chance to read my revisions, and then there might also be a short copy editing phase where I just make sure that every I is dotted and every T is crossed. But they might do that for me. We'll see. I've never worked with the Biblioteca Dantesca before, but I've really enjoyed working with them. So. So yes, it is, I guess, the second option, sometime soon, but
cool.
pretty soon, I think. Not several months out, maybe not even a couple months out, probably. And again, I could be wrong. I think around a month.
Cool. And is it going to be open source kind of thing? Like can
Yes,
just access open access rather?
yes, Biblioteca. I believe so. Biblioteca Dantesca is an online journal.
Cool.
It's hosted by University of Pennsylvania,
Hmm.
and edited by a scholar there, and maybe multiple scholars, but at least one of them that I've been in communication with.
Cool.
And I don't know if I have access through LSU, and I don't even realize it, or whether it is in fact open source. But it's called Bibliotesca, or excuse me, Biblioteca, Dantesca, and it's easy to find through a simple Google search, or
Yeah.
there are several hosts of it too, university websites as well. I'll be able to talk more about that too when I get things like URLs and DOI numbers and everything
Hmm.
gets very, very official. Um,
Right on.
it's mostly official right now. We're most of the way through casting the spell. Maybe I should say that I've written the rough draft of the spell, and now maybe even the final draft, but there's still a couple little things that might need to be fixed just to get the right punch to my Expelliarmus.
Right on. Cool. Yeah, I'm looking at it now. It looks like it is just open access. Cool. Well, yeah, looking forward to that. And I'm glad that you were able to, send it back in with all your revisions. And now you get a little bit of breathing room, a little bit of distance from it. Um, and we can pick up where we left off in FF9 here. Last time we were making our way through the upper plateau above the ice cavern. There is this strange village. We hijack an airship, kind of, sort of, and defeat some gnarly Vivi lookalikes. And as we are cruising along, we have this kind of back and forth between cutscenes and gameplay, as we've been seeing all through this game. And I think it's when you come through the the gate, right, the airship gate, it sort of closes behind us. It's badly damaged by all of the explosions of other little mini airships there. Zorn and Thorn's ship was taken over by the third of the Black Waltzes. So again, this idea of like threes and fours, right? So like you were mentioning, um, that seems to suggest that there is no going back there anytime soon. Um, that, of course, is the portion of the continent that is most directly controlled by Alexandria, although it sort of seems like Alexandria might be the major player continent wide. Um, their crystal is unique as far as we know, anyhow. And everyone seems to sort of defer to Princess Garnet as we are progressing here. The relationship between Lindblum and Alexandria is that of a regency, is the term they use. So whether that means that they're somehow in thrall or just sort of like maybe a semi separate entity. We don't really know, but there is some kind of family tie there because she calls the regent her uncle. Um, and this is all like sort of presented to us much like the opening sequence of the game, right? Like we have this kind of spectacular view of this, fantasy city. Um, but unlike Alexandria, which is, it's got the kind of nature, the waterfalls, the crystal, the light, and the birds and all that. This city is not focused on the details of characters so far. We haven't really seen them in cutscenes, but rather on the kind of overall impression of it's a very Miyazaki city, right? It's like this mixture of kind of industrial mechanisms on the one hand, and then lightness, airiness, kind of magical splendor on the other, and that fusion of the two is really the airship itself, right? So we cruise on in, we come through the Falcon's Gate. Um, this is the point at which our party is trying to sort of cheer Vivi up after this astonishing sequence of events, and the main way that they do that is like each of them sort of reassuring him that he's their friend, they're there for him, but also specifically Zidane is telling him, uh, look, this is an amazing view. This is so spectacular. So the same kind of feelings that the player is having, Vivi is having, and it's a really kind of beautiful way to conclude this series of cutscenes, I think, that lead us up to this point. But it is really like a new start to the game in a way. You could imagine this being the, in medias res opening to a Final Fantasy, where our team is arriving on an airship, um, it's badly damaged, and we're introduced to some of the political powers and the machinations going on. Uh, we finally understand why Tantalus was sent to kidnap the princess. And again, it's ironic that she also wanted to be kidnapped for much the same reason. So there's a kind of like there's no direct communication, it seems like, between Garnet and the Regent Cid, but they're very much on the same wavelength as far as like Alexandria, the Queen, something's up. Um, it's maybe not safe there for her, and she needed to come to a place where she would be safe, and this was where she thought she would be, and this is where they thought she would be as well. Um, and so there's a kind of like focus on her safety, and meanwhile, again, the party splits up. They start to explore different areas. Um, we get some of those active time scenes with Steiner, and we mostly are following though Zidane again. He's kind of back in his home turf, and we see a little bit of more of uh, his tendency to want to impress ladies, but also to sort of strike out at that come into play here. And I think it's significant that up to this point, we've been having this kind of group of characters that's pretty unified after their experiences together. And so now it's time to kind of introduce another element into that that dynamic, and that's the character that we meet in after we can kind of explore the castle a little bit. It's really more of a just a dialogue scene where Zidane, he's not satisfied with the food in the castle. He needs to go back to his roots, back to the I think it's the industrial district, although I could be mixing them up, where there's this pub, and that's where he is hitting on the waitress unsuccessfully, and the person at the bar tries to kind of intervene there and be like, step back, and they realize that they know each other. He pretends to slash actually forgets her name at first, but then eventually that's the kind of cue for us as the player to be able to name this new character, this playable character. The default is Freya, which is mythological and probably kind of interesting. Um, but she's sort of represented here as a dragoon type character, right? She's got the lance, got the spiky helmet with the wings, and she's very like rat-like. And it turns out that this is like a whole. This is the third part of the continent that we're about to get to, the kingdom of Burmecia. But yeah, she's got her whole backstory that's little by little kind of elaborated here. But the other big thing that is happening in town is the festival of the hunt, and this hunt is a quasi-religious but definitely very civic sort of pageantry type event. That is, it just so happens to be, as we're arriving, it's about to be in full swing, and it is the next kind of mini game sequence that involves a time element, like a ticking clock, kind of this classic thing within the series, and that is also the sort of the trigger for the next little bit of story arc here to begin, which focuses on our new character Freya primarily. So I was thinking, yeah, maybe if that's enough, kind of just like sketching the contours of this episode about Lindblum proper. If you remember, because it's been a while since you played this, remember things that struck you as you were arriving there, and some of these little bits of story and plot theme that are getting illuminated here. You want to pick up any of those threads?
Yeah, I appreciate that summary, and many once dull memories are being reinvigorated with light,
Good.
reinfused with light. But yeah, there were a couple of just themes I thought I might mention that I'd love to bear out. Fairy tale elements, which I think we start to see in great supply upon entrance to Lindblum, including entering on an airship, which I'll subnote is the same way that we first entered in with Zidane into Alexandria. And so it's almost like if I wanted to like lightly allegorize this video game that is modeled off of a fairy tale, that it's almost like the overhead perspective of the reader is
Mhm.
bringing the reader's consciousness into these new pages, into this new locale of action, to this new theater, as it were, but interactive, this new arcade, as it were. Um, but then and yeah, so those are really the first two things I want to mention, as well as I did want to think a little bit about Freya with her mythological name, her dragoon status, and her ability to jump. And how that comes up both in the mise en scène of the game itself, as well as manifests in fights. There will be a time just a little later on where the next place we go is Burmecia, the land of eternal rain,
Mhm.
near where you live, Seattle, I take that to be. Um, they
It is the northwest of the continent, so yeah.
But she will leave the party by jumping like 30 feet into the air, way beyond where we as non-dragoons are capable of getting to.
Mhm.
It's very interesting that she as a rat is capable of doing that, sort of like how a cat might do that. But so I just wanted to mention a couple, just to dove or return back to the themes I mentioned. A few of the things I mentioned, or I noticed that I thought were fairy tale themed. Um, Coming in on an airship, I wonder if the airship is sort of itself just a symbol of the act of reading. and of being able to take this abstract, absolute, and top-down perspective that's itself sort of separated from a place. That seems to be what we like about a story, right? It's bounded. We get to participate in it in a way without having to actually put anything on the line or engage or push the plot forward. We just get to let it wash over us. But that I think is my weakest connection. The monarch being turned into an oglop, which itself is something like a frog.
Yeah.
Reminds me of sort of the Princess and the Frog, a fairy tale. Um, Freya coming from a place that is the place of eternal rain. That strikes me as sort of a fairy tale motif of a place that has some sort of a condition that is temporary. Every place in, say, the uh, the normal world, even Seattle does have days when it doesn't rain. Very few,
Mhm.
but not this place. And that itself sort of strikes me as the sort of childlike, archetypal, absolutist thinking that happens in fairy tales. Like something is black, something is white, something is tall, something is short, or something is gigantic, and something is in miniature or minuscule. Um, but then also, of course, the famous hunt, the notion
Yes.
of a hunt, and that's not only fairy tale but mythological too, right? Like
Mhm.
the great hunt of the Erymanthian, or sorry, the cow. I'm forgetting my boars. Hercules went for, I think, the Erymanthian boar, but I think it was the Chalcedonian boar from the Iliad that Atalanta helped to kill. The same
Mm.
Atalanta whose husband to be was killed by having his heart thrown into a fire, or sorry, having some object that represented his heart thrown into a fire by his mother after he killed his uncles, disputing the claim for who should get the Caledonian boar's hide. Caledonian, not Chalcedonian. There we are. Um, and then she is the one who, of course, had that terrible race where any man who lost the race would sacrifice his
Mm.
life. And so she had to be distracted by three objects from the man who would eventually win. And so the hunt, and also prominent in the Aeneid, is a major hunt with where Dido and Aeneas first end up spending some time in a cave together, doing what is natural to men and women, according to Virgil. And so I just wanted to note that I haven't really been looking at this theme as closely as I should have, even though I know it is a major theme. One of the creators saying that this, maybe was it Sakaguchi who said that this was based, the sort of major theme of the work was to be like a fairy tale. Well, I'm just now taking note of these elements. I wonder if you saw more, if you've seen more in the ones I've seen, or if you've been taking account of them all along.
Uh, I guess the fairy tale aspect of it, um, I see a lot in the aesthetics. I like the image of the airship as sort of the consciousness that's free floating that can come and go. But it strikes me that the airships also are all uh, being destroyed, right? Like attacked. They're under threat. So the theater ship went down in the forest, right? And presumably has turned to stone until we can free it and our buddy Blank from that curse. I think one of the active time things we see here is actually the others having escaped down the river arrive at one of the gates, and so they're okay, right? Including Baku, who's an old friend of the regent, and anyway, so he's a kind of an important guy. So it's good that he's still kicking. Um, but the idea of the like fairy tale versus myth or fairy tale myth spectrum or something, I also find that really interesting to kind of dig into, right? So the um, maybe the more childlike uh, versions of fairy tales um, tend to be the ones that get repackaged, repurposed, retold um, in ways that are sort of commercialized and profitable. And Disney's the great example there. But it seems to me that there is some kind of kernel of each of them that is more mythic in quality to it, um, and that is what games like role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons, and all the video game ones that come after it, um, but also works of fantasy fiction like Tolkien, and sort of that type of literature and all that comes after him. Those seem to be more interested in delving into the mythic, right? And they can take those elements, recombine them in various ways, and then sure enough, those also become, commercialized, become successful, become popular. Um, but in either case, it seems like there's an essence or something there that is not um, captured, not fully exhausted, certainly not uh, perverted by this process, and that by sort of reading back into these games, we can approach, access, uncover that something, that mythic core. Um, I think that it has a lot to do with language, and the human body, like you were alluding to, right? The parts of our nature that are psychological, but embodied as well, including sexual, romantic, and all that, um, and that get at sort of the way that humans change over their lives, right, from children to adults, and the way that certain lessons are passed on within families and societies. Like those all seem like um, mythic qualities, right? Mythic questions, mythic uh, truths, or something, right? Wisdom, and these games, I think, are conveying those things. Um, in their own way, with some amount of bastardization and weird kind of layerings of different world myths and cultures onto each other. Um, but I think one place that we see this in Lindblum, so aside from the airship which is damaged, um, there's the airship which is stolen, right? And Sid tells one version of the story in public with his, chancellor there or whatever, and then he tells a very different version of the story to Princess Garnet Dagger when they're in private. And so it wasn't somebody who snuck in, cast a spell on him, and abducted his wife. No, no. In fact, it was his wife who caught him in flagrante, uh, cast the spell on him, and stole the airship that was, his prize work, the new steam-powered airship or whatever. Um, so he's very much, in the wrong. And this kind of transformation motif is, it's there in fairy tales, it's there in myths, but it has this layer of, sort of humor and, yeah, almost satire that's on top of this too, because there's always a Sid in the Final Fantasy. Sid is usually associated with the airships in some way. What's the Sid gonna be this time? This is a funny way to reveal that, and it's pretty delightful actually. So yeah, the idea of the theater and then now the festival being sort of manifestations of the fairy tale, the mythic, um, and the ways in which they're connected to the earth and disconnected to the earth. I mean, that's all, I think, yeah, very, very evocative. So
Yeah, I
I like
think
it.
you're really touching on something interesting there, which is that possibly what a myth does is it conveys an archetypal truth at some level of complexity. The simplest myths, perhaps being fairy tales, which do convey some sort of archetypal, ethical, or sort of universal truth about life, like let's say Aesop's fable about the nature of the scorpion stinging
Mm,
the frog or something like that,
okay.
where some myths can be vastly complicated and difficult to understand because they're perhaps conveying many truths
Mm,
or some or few or one extremely complicated truth. And that's something I think you really put your finger on, that even though the aesthetic of this game is fairy tale, even with the dimensions of the figures being consciously made to be more childlike, which actually caused problems with the representation of Dagger as opposed to Aiko later on, because one actually is a child, but one is a teenager, so not very old, but she's made to look more like a woman in order to differentiate them. Um, but that's something that Final Fantasy does very well, and in particular, this game does extremely well, and I think prides itself on is giving access to differing layers of truth and to differing grades of meaning, and to offering at the outset perhaps some image of a fairy tale level truth of like black and white, good and evil. But then in every installment we've considered, and we've considered two pretty closely now, but we've played many more than that, than those, excuse me, that Final Fantasies do an excellent job of chipping away at our conventional notions of good and evil and who's good and who's bad, whether it's my own self, my own mind, my own people that I come from, or my nation. All of these things can be potentially problematic. Like in Final Fantasy VII, I'm part of an eco-terrorist group. I have to understand that about myself. My own mind is sort of a prisoner to another person's mind in the beginning of it, and I have to break free of that. And then it turns out that this company that I used to work for is actually a major threat, but that there are even greater threats that are even more interwoven with my life emerge. But they all have their own motivations and their own, I think, strong motivations for acting in the way they do. And that's something that I think one comes to understand while playing Final Fantasy. In fact, I saw there was a Final Fantasy Union movie, or it's not movie, a list about sympathetic villains in Final Fantasy, and many of the major ones, including Sephiroth, are considered sympathetic because even though they do great, they commit what might be called in conventional terms from one perspective, great evil. They the things that lead them to do it are very understandable to the player, and I think we'll run into that over and over and over again in this game when we come to understand Queen Braun's motivations, when we come to understand who Dagger is, because that's another layer to this. Individuals in these games do not know who they are at the beginning of them. Zidane does not know who he is. Vivi does not know who he is. Dagger does not know who she is. They don't even, all three of them do not even know what their actual race is, which is something I also wanted to add to this representation and its aesthetic. Something about Final Fantasy VIII is that there were only a couple other races from
Yeah.
human represented, and it turns out that actually two of them were one. One was just a more evolved form. The sort of Mughals were just unevolved versions of I'm forgetting the name.
Shumi, right? Shumi and
The
Moomba.
Shumi tribe. Yes,
Shumi
and
and
the
the Moomba.
Moombas. They were called Moombas. That's right. Because there were no moons. Um,
Should have been.
but even everybody in the party, and this sort of makes sense because perhaps they came from different, family or parents that of the same nation. They all seem to be the same race and certainly the same species. But unlike Final Fantasy VII, where you get what appears to be a cat on top of a Mog, you're sort of a vampire guy, and you have somebody from Wutai. Wutai is definitely not Midgar. They were in conflict with each other. Uh, and of course, Red 13 and Ares or Aerith are different races slash species. Final Fantasy IX really sort of explodes that notion. I mean, the Burmesians are giant anthropomorphic talking rats. The Ku are giant, sort of corpulent, I don't know, salamander-like beings with giant tongues.
Yeah.
Um, and then there are also humans. There are also black mages. Also these things that we'll soon come to know called genomes. And also there's even a race which we'll soon find out about. One of the characters in our party is called a summoner race. They are in fact distinct from humans and having a horn on their head. And so there are all these interesting physical indicators of the races. The races are distinct, very distinct from each other in this game. And again, I think a sort of fairy tale, childlike aesthetic way in order to draw attention to that fact. Now, but the one thing I want to say to hedge that, in conjunction with what I said earlier about the layers of the onion, as it were, mentioning like drawing attention to the notion of the onion knife from Final Fantasy II, is that even in such a fairy tale world with its fairy tale aesthetic, but its sort of mythological core, um, major, I think, human problems are present that would hurt the ability for one to experience escapism rather than to learn truth from this game. What do I mean? I mean that death is present in this game. It's extremely present. Um, Betrayal, familial, political is present. Of course, we know that Alexandria and Lindblum are very close, so much so that the king of Lindblum is the princess of Alexandria feels comfortable running to him as basically the person that she feels closest to beyond her immediate family. And he's going to be attacked by Alexandria. Honor and duty are responsible, or sorry, and responsibility are present in the image of Steiner, but then not in simplistic ways, because eventually he will have to make a decision between defending Garnett and following orders. And there will be a distinction between how what he needs to do in order to follow either of those paths. They will no longer be simple, unitary. And so he, like Squall, will have to make a stand and make a decision at some point. Um, and so I just wanted to mention that I think that that might be something at play in this game. So moving from realism in the aesthetic to a fairy tale aesthetic, but even in using sort of visual hyperbole to augment the differences and to highlight the differences between peoples and to make them unrealistic, that still there is a certain ethical realism to the situations that they find themselves in when interacting with other people and between nations. It's almost as if there's some sort of naturalistic, epiphenomenal ethic that manifests the moment you have sort of conscious individuals interacting with each other,
Hmm.
regardless of their differing, natures, as
Mhm.
artificial, natural, whether they're made from mist or whether they cause mist when they die. Those issues haven't even really been they're being touched on now and hinted at, but they haven't been, I would say, fully broached yet.
Yeah. I mean, people in this town are talking about the difference between mist power and steam power,
Yes.
right? They even have like some chronology going on because they're interested in the succession of the Cid dynasty, right? And there's like statues of the different Cids around, and you can kind of piece together that, and it makes sense that this is the ninth Cid, right? So again, this kind of self-referential thing going on with that, but that this would kind of take place, as they say in game, around the turn of the 1700s to 1800s. So like the beginning of the 19th century in game, much like the real world, analog, is this kind of transition from like a traditional worldview to a modern technological steam powered world. And there's all these images of like mechanisms, clockwork gears, um, of course, the theater itself, right? This kind of artifice, which is always seeking new kinds of spectacle and ways to enthrall the customers, the audience. Um, all of that's here, but there's also the church, right? And it's kind of tucked away. It's like almost an afterthought to the people, but there are some people there, and it's beautiful and all. And it has this connection to the festival of the hunt. Like people there are very interested in that. And so there's sort of like maybe a worry that that piece of their culture will be lost as they're moving into the future. Um, Now, the resonant arc discussion of this section of the game makes a big deal about that, actually, like how festivals, although they may seem barbaric, fighting animals, and even one of the shopkeepers brings this up, like she hates to see the animals killed. Um, Such a festival, for all of its problems or blindnesses or whatever, also has an important, cohering quality to it for the culture, and that when you lose it, you truly do give something up, even if it's in the interests of humanity or enlightenment or whatever it is. It's pretty easy to see that kind of mapped onto a religious belief system of some kind, right? A belief in God, even. Um, it's kind of easy to see this. the way that Benjamin, Walter Benjamin or Benjamin, talks about this actually in something I was looking at recently about this problem of storytelling in the modern age, and he actually has some interesting reflections on fairy tales versus myths that are kind of coming to mind here. But he makes a big deal about how in the modern age we are distanced from an encounter with death. People dying, they don't do that in the home anymore. They don't do that in an intimate setting, a family setting. They do that somewhere else. They do that in a sanitized, industrialized way almost, and it's kind of monstrous. Even war, right, is fought on industrial lines, and no longer is something that people can really um, understand, talk about in the ways that the myths have sort of instructed us up to this point. And so there's all sorts of kinds of breakdowns there. Um, we don't get a lot about religion here, but it does strike me that in the same way as a festival of the hunt or something like that, um, or a theater performance, this game itself is one of those, forces that could help people cohere together. It's a form of entertainment that also carries mythic qualities, right? And so that's the kind of additional layer that I would add on to their discussion, which I thought was great. But just to make that further move to be like, so what is the sort of self-consciousness of the game and the Final Fantasy series in light of that sort of discussion, right? Is the series similarly changing into something that loses that essential nature, right? That seems like the anxiety that's at work, that's really driving this particular entry in the series. And I think it's interesting to think about in light of the representation of the festival of the hunt that we get here, which is kind of like a tricky thing. Um, the sequence of events here is pretty cool, right? Because we are free to explore as Zidane, and as we do so, there's these active time things that pop up, and so we see what's going on with Steiner. He is being misunderstood by a female red mage in the marketplace. He's tasting the pickles of a grandma who's sort of like um, you know, uh, wants him to get back on his feet and try again. Don't give up. We see Vivi in a shop getting the Kupo nut, so another like food item, which is going to have plot implications later. Um, and they're both hearing about the festival and all this, right? Vivi's kind of excited about it. Um, and then we finally, when you go into the theater district and you find the hideout, there's like some business with another actor that's sort of a little side quest of some kind. The actor and his friend, the artist, um, maybe are going to be important later. It's unclear. But anyway, you can get his autograph. You can see how popular he is, and Zidane is kind of like jealous of that. These two little kids come in, and Zidane has a nice little interaction with them. And then the bell starts to ring. That's the point at which we see, okay, so this is where we see the survivors of Tantalus up at the gate, having gotten out of the forest, um, and they're still trying to cure the petrification. Um, they're making coffee. They're doing this and that. Um, but we also see uh, Garnet briefly feeling like she is kind of cooped up. So again, she's sort of back where she started in many ways, um, where she's unable to be an active force for her own story, right? She's just sort of a side piece, a waiting game right now. Um, and that's the point at which the Festival of the Hunt will kind of kick into action. So you can do all the exploration you want. You can start synthesizing items, right? You can get some letters about Ruby, who's starting her own theater back in Alexandria, where she was abandoned when everyone else escaped. Um, and then the three characters who are going to participate in the festival, a little bit surprisingly, actually, uh, it's not Steiner, but it's Vivi, Zidane, and Freya, who hasn't officially joined our team yet, but we know she will. Um, there is this kind of like uh, this quality of like a misdirection where it's suggested that what each of them is going to win um, depend rather is dependent on the player's choice, right, in some way. But it's a little bit like misleading because, from what I understand, basically you just have the choice of either going all out and winning as Zidane, or um, somehow losing in the final battle, and then Freya will be victorious. And I'm not sure, but it's maybe the only way to get Vivi to win is by having both Zidane and Freya knocked out of the running in some way. Um, and each of them has a different like prize. Um, Supposedly, Zidane is going to go on a date with Garnet if he wins. Um, there's like a little cut scene between the two. Um, he kind of makes a mistake where he is building on a conversation that he had with a different girl, right? The girl at the pub, and unfortunately, she picks up on that. Unfortunately for him, and so he's trying to repair that by getting her to go on a date with him if he wins the hunt. Um, but the other two, Freya wins like an accessory item, um, and Vivi wins a card, I want to say. Um, but it's not actually possible to go on that date. So it's like the kind of the worst outcome actually is hiding behind that door number one. So this is, yeah, a point at which I feel like the game is being pretty sneaky and misleading the player a little bit here. If what you're going for is seeing more of the story by winning with the main character, which is like the most obvious route, you actually never get that payoff. I think you get some gold instead or gil. Um, but the other two items are, at least at this stage of the game, unique and can only be acquired by kind of messing with the outcome there. Um, in the scene between them, there's a couple other things that happen up on top of the castle. Um, I think it's important here that Dagger is sort of expressing her own helplessness or her sense of her own helplessness when, as we've seen, she actually is like very important to the party. Um, they are gazing out of like a telescope on top, and you're sort of getting a chance to see the surrounding area. Um, and they kind of end on this note of her sussing out that their original plan was to use a sleeping weed of some kind. And so then she convinces Zidane to give her some. Uh, she's singing. There's again this idea that somehow this is a magical song or something. We got a little hint of that in Dali, but it's emphasized even more here. So again, we're just kind of like uh, introducing little elements that are gonna develop more later. Uh, yeah, yeah. So then the hunt. There's there's royal action figures. There's a little scene with Freya doing her jumping thing. Um, Sid struggling to wrap his brain around the new engine he's been working on, and yeah, again, Zidane striking out with with the princess. Um, yeah, yeah. How did you do with the hunt? Did you know what was going on, or did you just kind of?
So my usual way of sort of playing until I need the strategy guide rather than using it all the way along as I should, I managed to lose to Freya even while trying to win.
Oh, nice.
I
Okay.
don't know if that was a function of playing this on the Switch and it being the remastered version, whether they just made it easier for her to win on that one. There are such options that one can choose, like to battle with a very high, to be invincible in battle, to move fast. These are things I don't usually choose with Final Fantasy IX.
Mhm.
Though I did accidentally win one fight once by accidentally becoming invincible and not knowing that I had. But I do try and limit that sort of thing so that I can have the real experience. Something I wanted to mention though, that came upon my mind, that Athena granted me while you were speaking was something we talked a lot about when we spoke about Final Fantasy VIII, which was the subversion of normal themes, and something we actually talked about earlier today, which is the subversion of fairy tale themes. The notion of uh, a sort of thief, like say the Hobbit, for example, more like a fairy tale mythological, somewhere between those two, or fairy tale and mythological creature itself. Zidane is being located, or sorry, what is the term I'm looking for? He seems to be being set up to be the figure who saves the damsel in distress, who saves the
Mhm.
princess. This is a archetypal folktale theme, fairy tale theme, mythological theme, and even video game theme with Mario going to save the princess, Princess Peach. But something that will very soon happen is that Dagger will take agency for herself. Not only has she already changed her name, changed her way of speaking, she's changing the trajectory of her life and perhaps even her alliances here, but she is going to soon take agency from those around her, show a bit
Yeah.
of Odyssean cunning,
Yeah.
and set out on her own path and make a path for herself. And so she continuing, I would say, the line of strong female characters in Final Fantasies continues on in the same way that Celeste and Terra are our protagonists in the World of Ruin and the initial world that we have. Final Fantasy VII, the damsel in distress is actually killed. Uh, she she is not saved at all. And if one really wants to think allegorically about it, perhaps Cloud has some hand in killing her in the same way that he, viciously beats her at the temple, at the place where he gives up the black materia to Sephiroth. And I don't know how Rebirth is going to handle that moment, or what is going to happen exactly. But and then of course Final Fantasy VIII, Renoa fights against being the damsel in distress, and and Squall really tries to be her knight, but she ends up being a creature of, I think, vastly greater power than
Mhm.
he is. And I think that will also end up being the case with Dagger, who seemingly will have the ability to summon Eidolons at some point. Though we do not know Zidane's true nature and the nature of his powers yet. So perhaps he'll be able to match her in some way. But that all goes to say is that the game is, I think, doing a lot of work to set up, um, like you said, conventional directions that might lead us to believe that we're going to go those directions, and then we go opposite directions.
Yeah.
We think we're going to go right down the spiral, but in fact, we go left in the Inferno. You have to keep going the same direction to keep going down the spiral. So it wouldn't make much sense to keep trying different directions. That
Yep.
said, um, right. So I also wanted to touch on the notion of the theater and the festival, and I really like that they pay attention to the idea that collective expressions of or when people come together in order to enjoy a collective experience, that has some value. And it might have traditionally been called religious. We might now call it communal. But that there's a real fear that when the world transitions from a sort of mist power, which is literally spirit or soul power,
Mhm.
because of the mechanism of this tree called the Aether tree, which we'll soon learn about, well, soonish learn about, to this more scientific mechanism. of steam. So we see here like sort of steampunk motif, but also sort of an industrial revolution motif of, and also sort of enlightenment motif of moving from sort of a religious world or even organic naturalist world into a steam powered world that is part capitalist and having this factory that uses uh, this product of the world in a very Mako reactor like way from Final Fantasy VII in order to create these um, living beings. Some might
Mhm.
say abominations, but Vivi is certainly seemingly not an abomination, or if he is one, one that I would very much like as a friend and like as a party member. So I wouldn't say it with any negative connotations, though perhaps that is what he is. Um, but that this time of transition is being showed both negatively and that it results in mass or an exploitation of resources of the planet for gain and imperialist gain by one particular people, the Alexandrians. But it also shows the sort of Enlightenment, scientific revolution aspect of freeing or liberating oneself through creation of technology based on the resources of a planet. So airships are really cool and great ways to get around and to create trade and relationship between the Lindblumians and the Alexandrians. And so there is a major transition happening in the world that is leading to, say, I think the forgetting of certain things like the existence of summoners and even the very nature of the world in the same way that in Final Fantasy VII, which is a major correlate to 9 in several ways. There were these ancients, these
Mhm.
Cetrans, who the scientists of Shinra studied these ancient books. They sound a lot more like scholars than scientists in order to discover them, and then in so doing, discover more about the nature of the world. Um, even though in Final Fantasy VII, and I would say Final Fantasy VIII too, the world is obviously a futuristic world. Um, in both of those worlds, there is some sort of ancient knowledge that needs to be rediscovered by those people who have moved so far into the future. Similarly, but also very differently, we have a much earlier period of time, like you said, much farther ahead than even the Middle Ages, as this game would seem to be representing at first, more like the transition from the 1700s to the 1800s, 18th to 19th century, and there being a necessity of dealing with changing mores and changing ways of living because of the changing mechanisms of existence, and how people deal with these changes. There are political changes, imperial changes. The world itself is trying to change in a way that we don't yet understand, and there are also, of course, these Lindblumians innovating on the technological sphere as well. And so we see how differing people deal with and create change as well. On the one hand, Alexandrians seem to be engaging in what might be considered negative aspects of capitalism, factory labor, creation of abominations. On the other hand, the Lindblumians are creating these works of art, these technological, they have this beautiful technological paradise. They're very Estarian, though not as futuristic. And they seem to emphasize the value of the engineering marvels that can be developed based on the level of technology present and almost present in the world in which they're manifesting themselves.
Yeah, so this idea that the level of technology is like a concern here, it's also closely related to the rulers of the place, right? Like they are the leaders, they are the visionaries, and they're the ones driving the technological change. Um, I think uh, what's what Garnett's doing here, taking control, using this kind of magical approach, um, you know, putting everyone to sleep and then escaping, bringing Steiner with her. Um, she seems to be like not. as interested in um, flight. She's not stealing an airship or something, although there's a bunch of like air buses that take you around the city. It seems like there's airships everywhere. She could have gone that route, but she prefers to go on the surface of the Earth. She's um, resolutely non-technological in that way. So I find that to be kind of an interesting dynamic that's opening up here. Um, Similarly with Freya and the Burmesians, right? They do seem like extremely medieval. They seem to be kind of living in some sort of a medieval romance, even because her whole backstory involves her like looking for her lost lover, Sir Fratley.
Yes.
He disappeared. She's looking for him. Maybe he would show up at the Festival of the Hunt. Like that's a theory that's kind of thrown out there by the Resident Arc folks, and I think it's a good one. Um, there's also though this element of self-consciousness that comes up in there's even a NPC interaction you can have after the festival's done. If you go around and talk to everyone, one of the grannies who's like selling pots or something in the marketplace, she'll be like, "Are you having fun with what you're doing?" And you can say, "Yeah." She's like, "I'm glad." Or you can say, "No, this game sucks." It's like an actual option. And she's like, "Well, maybe you should go buy a different game." Right. So there's this like kind of humor there, and there's lots of little references. I think you really start to notice it in this section of the game. References to other media objects, other games particularly. So like there's some weird little bit of dialogue that happens with the fountain in the castle where it's like Zidane's like, "There's nowhere to put the medal." I had to look that one up. I could tell it was a reference to something. It's not to a Final Fantasy, it's actually to Resident Evil, apparently. That's what people say. I couldn't find out more about that. I've never played those games. There's reference to Parasite Eve in the two workers in the synthesis shop. Supposedly that's something about their dynamic or even their names, Torres and Wayne. These are like characters from Parasite Eve, another Square game. There's a really clear one to Cloud himself, right? You can make fun of the suit of armor, which is making fun of Rusty, aka Steiner, but also you can look at the swords and it's like, oh, there was a guy with spiky hair who used to use one like that, right? Obviously, got to be Cloud. Um, so there's kind of this, you know, self-consciousness, this awareness that's played for laughs mostly. Um, but I do think it's interesting to see that the dynamic is not only unidirectional here towards greater and greater technological developments, right? There is really a countervailing current that's represented of people, of characters who have agency, who have incredible powers, and those are connected with, the terrestrial, the old ways, the maybe the backward even. And so, seeing that. Oh, and the names, right? There's a Palamporum reference. That's a Final Fantasy IV thing. Fabul, the last name of the Cids, is a Final Fantasy IV thing. Um, we are like, rooted in that way, and we go from the tops of the castle, looking in the telescope, down to the depths, and we go out through the bottom gate, uh, into the mist, the places that we could see before. Now we're actually down there by the end of this sequence. Um, and that's where we find our next wonderful party member who we've alluded to a few times here. Uh,
Sometimes the way down is the way up. All right. Well, as way of a conclusion, I just want to mention three things that we have mentioned, but I have managed not to say much about or not say the key thing about,
mm,
at least when it comes to my contribution. One is regarding the places to gather that you mentioned and that Resonant Arc made a big deal out of. I think what's interesting about the 2000 date in particular is that cell phones were just coming around, were just
mhm.
being sold in malls by very hard selling individuals who would say, "Hey, come over here. Let me talk to you for a second."
Little kiosks.
You know,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
active engagers. Um, and so, but at that time, I don't think anybody could have told or predicted how big cell phones would be, maybe the salespeople themselves and maybe the companies. But at that time, I think there was a real concern that how people gathered was changing. That since the 50s and 60s, really people had started gathering instead of just in social clubs and blah, 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 in their homes and around televisions. But that was then seen as sort of a natural way to hang out with people. But in the early 2000s and late 90s, there more and more televisions were making their way into homes, and so watching television could become a more private affair, and in particular playing video games was often a more private affair. I should also add that the internet had just really come around like a couple years before this, so prosperity leading to more televisions being a part of American households, cellular phones coming around, as well as the internet. There was a real, I think, confusion of which technologies would lead to more privacy and which would lead to more public engagement. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, the cell phone was a way to connect with people, but now I would say that in 2025, people would probably consider playing video games a more communal activity, whether they be online or retro, because of the fandoms that exist now, than being on one cell phone. Even though one is connected to the internet on one cell phone, and now the cell phone and the internet are basically one and the same thing in a way that they definitely were not in
Yeah.
2000. The internet was a long way away from being on the cell phone in any sort of meaningful way. But I also wanted to mention two more fairy tale conventions. Dagger, seeming very not like a princess, but much more like a witch, uses a sleeping potion.
Mm.
And then very much like a princess, takes a knight with her, or like a Final Fantasy VIII witch, as it were. And then also, I just wanted to mention that it's funny that you say that the church is not a big part of this game. It seems not to be a big part of Final Fantasy VIII either, or Final Fantasy VII. Something we definitely talked about in Final Fantasy VIII, but not. I can't remember how much or whether we talked about it in seven. You do find some religious fanatics, but they tend to be sort of scientifically or mythologically based, whether they're Sephiroth and he thinks he's a Cetra, or they're Hojo and he thinks that what he's doing is going to change the world in some meaningful way. But Final Fantasy X, that comes after 9, I
Mm.
think we see a huge resurgence of the place of religion
Yeah.
in the society as a whole. Not necessarily positive, not necessarily negative, something we'll have to talk about at some point, and surely we will. But
Hmm.
I just in terms of compensation, it seems as if even the the story designers themselves feel that absence in the games, at least so much that it becomes, like, I would say, one of the governing motifs of Final Fantasy X, and possibly even 12 and 13 too, though I'll have to play them a little closer in order to substantiate that notion.
Hmm.
Um,
No, it's a big thing in Tactics, which is around the same
hmm,
time. It's a big thing in Xenogears, of course, this kind of
yes.
like black sheep, almost Final Fantasy. Yeah, no, that's a good reminder. Um, Now there's at least one more thing before we go. We finally hear not the name Kuja, but the character is mentioned, I think for the first time in Princess Garnet's kind of exposition to Sid of what they're doing there. Right after Steiner like punches him across the screen, right, in Oglop form, and she recognizes his mustaches, and she's like, "Oh, strange things are happening. There's this strange man in the castle, and they're bringing all these black mages. They're forming an army." So I think that's the first time we've heard about him. Haven't seen him yet. There's also, as you're leaving from the basement area, I don't know if this ever is used again, if we come back to this or not, but just one of the great like backdrop images in all of video games, I want to say. Like if you go, it's totally extra though. Like you don't have to go there at all. But instead of going to the Dragon Gate, if you go to the Serpent Gate, so the harbor area, um, you see this incredible painted backdrop of like the gate itself kind of set into this cliff, and there's little kind of arches and things, very Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, uh, and then the little little dock there in the water. And then beyond that, like more cliffs going off, more water, and this kind of dark, cloudy uh, sky, but then with like light breaking through in these really interesting ways. The whole like way that it's lit and kind of like misty as well, with uh, that being the reason that the harbor is never used anymore. Um, yeah, just something about that, like this almost unused, right, place. Um, it nevertheless has been um, given such a beautiful treatment by whoever's job it was to make this screen. Um, I just I feel like those little details that are so easy to miss. Um, this to me felt very Final Fantasy VIII, right? A totally extra, totally missable, and yet an incredible amount of thought, a incredible amount of work went into making this little scene. Um, it's a kind of wonderful craftsmanship, artistry that the series uh, has always been, I think, known for, but particularly as they're in this kind of golden age of their development. So then, yeah, we head out. We hear about uh, Stiltskin being on his journey in the Mughal side quest. He's arrived in Burmecia, where it's raining, and that's we're in his footsteps here. So I think for next time we can sort of talk about all the stuff that we can explore in between, and then we can get to Burmecia and what's going on up there.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to that and talking more about the different strategies the peoples have for dealing with the emergence of modernity, being knight-like medieval
Mm.
creatures like the dragoons of Burmecia, whatever it is that the summoners have chosen to do, and the direction that Garnet, with her terrestrial plotting across, plotting home, gets her. Though she will take a tram at one point. Uh,
That's right.
but not an airship, and so much less conspicuous. Um, and that's something we didn't get to as much, but I think you mentioned this time, which I think connects very nicely with the notion of layers of truth. And I was made to think about that by the figure of Sid. Um, but there are also differing sorts of truth, like private and public, which was brought up when Sid gave a private story and a public story. And something perhaps we'll be able to get into next time is in the same way that Kuja is sort of foreshadowed and with his malevolence, in the same way that Sephiroth has a strong build-up before we ever meet him. Perhaps we could discuss, or we'll have the chance to discuss, positive intelligent figures. So we know about the representation of mad scientists like Hojo and Kefka, but here we have a very nice Sid, and we'll have Professor Tot coming up, who is himself, I think, an owl. He's some manner of bird, anthropomorphic bird, as perhaps all teachers are. Um, but this reminds me also of, say, Bugenhagen from
Yes.
Seven, who is very much antithetical to Hojo, and it seems to be sort of magical too. He floats around, sort of like one of those Harkonnens in Dune. Uh,
Uh,
but without the negative connotations. Um, but yes, I'm looking forward to getting to Bermesia and seeing what the next scene unfolds.
Sounds good. Thanks again.
Thank you.